Hello there. My name is Matthew Orr. I'm a Eurasia analyst here at RANE. I'm here with my colleague Chase Blazik. He's our APAC analyst. Chase, we're going to talk Russia and China. They're storied and fascinating and complex relationships. I think just to lead us off, we can talk about the recent meeting between Putin and Xi in Central Asia, and kind of use that whole visit from Xi, that foreign trip by Xi, is kind of a way to think about and frame the conversation.
Yeah,
I just the first question I would have for you, as kind of as a general question, is how was that whole trip, right, kind of as a whole, taken in China? I'm sure it was described as a success, and it received a lot of press coverage. Or what is your kind of general kind of takeaway or readout of the visit?
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Every international meeting is either going to be the other folks screwed up or we did a great job. That's sort of how the coverage of these meetings goes in China. But yeah, this was a way for Xi Jinping to re-up his diplomacy, because obviously he's sort of been bubble boy, staying in China for the last 2.5 years, not leaving except for Hong Kong for I forget what the anniversary was, what exactly the number was, but he went there, and even after he did like a quarantine, there were some pretty embarrassing pictures when he was there. If he was, 100 feet away from the nearest person, he was clearly trying to be very careful with COVID. So it's notable that he went to the SEO in Uzbekistan, because it is sort of showing that they're trying to restart this diplomacy. But as we talked about somewhat jokingly in the chat, yeah, he wasn't present at all the sort of extracurriculars, right? He didn't show up at the dinner where you get to, chat over fancy olives and caviar, and he didn't show up to whatever the tourist trips were, along with all the other world leaders. It was certainly not a note showing that China's going to be easing up on zero COVID anytime soon, because and they were asked directly, why was she not at these visits? And he said, well, you got to be careful, COVID-19 protocols. So from that standpoint, it doesn't mean a lot for China from COVID standpoint, but from Russia, it was pretty interesting to see both sides sort of pursuing their own interest at SEO, and I think this is the first time we saw in the recent weeks this sort of spate of statements of China reiterating, we support sovereignty, we support every country having non-intervention from other countries, and not saying Moscow, we don't appreciate what you're doing, just saying this is our general stance. And it's interesting because this has been pitched in the international media as a real turning point for China. And in some ways it is, because Beijing gets to choose what they say at these meetings, right? And they chose to say this. So that's notable. But it's also notable that they've been saying this the whole time. It's just now it's becoming much more obvious because Russia is doing more and more with Ukraine, with mobilization, with all this. And so every time China repeats even the same exact message, it seems to even highlight that divide between their stances on Ukraine even more. So yeah, that was sort of my perspective on it. Love to hear yours too.
Let's remember that even before the SEO summit, what did Tokayev actually do as his very first visit that was actually not directly within the confines of the SEO? He did a bilateral visit to Kazakhstan, and essentially gave a strong show of support for the country's president, President Tokayev. And
right, you're talking Xi's visit to Kazakhstan the day before. Yeah.
And right, and so I think that visit kind of heightened a lot of dynamics that you're talking about, right? Where it was one thing to kind of say these empty platitudes before Russia invaded Ukraine, but then it's different to do it well after the invasion has gone poorly, and on Kazakh soil, and in the company of the Kazakh president, right? Because it would appear that things that maybe didn't hold true in the case of Ukraine potentially would hold true in the case of a country like Kazakhstan, and it just underscores Central Asia as this space, this geographic area that, despite attempts to paper over and say that Russian-Chinese relations are highly cooperative, there are going to be these places where their interests are just fundamentally potentially at heads.
And notable because of what we've discussed before, that you are watching very closely. Kazakhstan is sort of like one of the next areas. I don't know what timeline you would put on it, but in the near future, where we're looking for some sort of Russian, I don't know what to call it, coercion, military shenanigans. But Kazakhstan is very worried about what's happening in Ukraine because they're also a former satellite state of the Soviet Union, and they sort of form a geographical border between the rest of Central Asia. So this would be where Moscow intervenes. And so, yeah, I think Xi Jinping, that being his first visit outside the country in 2.5 years, is to Kazakhstan. And he's saying, we support you, all of this. I think that can certainly be viewed. I don't know if this was their intention, but it could certainly be viewed as Beijing saying, hey, Moscow, like, we're interested in Kazakhstan too. So don't think this is just like Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess more broadly, if we talk about Russia-China relations, it seems that China, on the one hand, doesn't want to rhetorically tie itself super closely to what Russia does, but on the other hand, it's clear that there has to be limits to that. And I guess I'll broach this question just because it's one that I think about all the time, and I'm sure other people ask. It's, if I understand what kind of you have told me about this, it's that China's threshold to kind of publicly question Russian actions, or to begin more publicly leaning into, I guess I would put it just that way, questioning what Russia has done, and possibly criticizing in a more public way, it's a really difficult threshold, because it would be such a shattering change of Chinese policy that that's not a threshold that we're approaching, and we don't really even have a good perception of what Russian actions could prompt something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we could literally go nuclear in Ukraine. That could prompt China to say, whoa, we're your partner and everything, but what are you doing? Or chemical weapons, TAC nukes, anything that's sort of like even these sort of in between steps toward any sort of nuclear war. That, of course, would push China to draw a line. But that is not a very comforting argument, because it's, like I said, it's literally going nuclear. So it doesn't help with all the gray zone and the most likely scenario where they don't do this. Russia doesn't do this. So then where does China go from there?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, you would know, being a student of Russian history as well as I do, that the value of propaganda is quite high in authoritarian societies. And so you usually have a propaganda standpoint and an actual practical policy standpoint. And so, yeah, I mean, China has to, from sort of a propaganda standpoint, support sovereignty writ large, and support Russia. And then the practical side of this is Russia is one of China's few powerful partners who can help stand against the sort of spread of Western liberal democratic ideals, which sounds very highfalutin in like IR theory, DC talk, but it really does worry China. They do not like the idea of Western liberal democracy spreading to China. And I should say Beijing doesn't like this. The Chinese people, unfortunately, don't get a lot of say in the representation there. So Beijing's quite worried about this, and they see the U.S. as not just, a propagator of soft power and occasional military toppler of other countries, which that could be enough to worry China, but also as a country that is bound and determined with real policy and the CIA and all of this. It kind of sounds tinfoil hat, but China truly believes the U.S. is bound and determined to bring down the Chinese Communist Party through whatever means possible, including the spread of Western liberal democratic ideals, and that Russia is one of its few partners in combating that, though maybe not for the same reasons, right? Russia has its own reasons, but nonetheless, for those reasons, China can't afford to ditch Russia over anything. And in fact, as we've seen with the Ukraine war, it seems like it would take quite a bit for China to ditch Russia.
And precisely on the back of what you just said, now I want to return back to Kazakhstan. Because we just talked about Xi going there and the seeming support of the Kazakh leader, and how it's this country of their interest butting heads. Essentially, what's taking place in Kazakhstan is that you have a Kazakh leader who he does not support kind of I would say the radical pro-democracy faction, but his
safe democratization.
Yes, but on the other hand, his strategy to reduce unrest and secure his regime's popularity is to lean into, I would call, modest pro-democracy forms, and he gives a lot of lip service to things like separation of powers and real local governance and things like that. And as this guy is leaning into this path and this rhetoric, it creates an environment where either the reforms are going to get out of hand and a more pro-democratic element is eventually going to come to power in the country, or his regime will essentially endorse that kind of thing, that kind of rhetoric or that kind of philosophy or approach. And then, of course, it draws up all these questions of, well, hold on, if Russia invaded Ukraine because of a 2014 pro-Western color revolution and they're deepening security ties with NATO, and then you look at Kazakhstan, you could say, well, a lot of the same things are taking place. You have a pro-liberalization, pro-democracy elements. You have a NATO member, Turkey, supplying drones, other weapons, essentially intended to deter. I mean, I don't. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think the Chinese are going to invade Kazakhstan. I think that it's clear that China doesn't need these Kazakhstan does not need these capabilities for counterterrorism operations. The only point of these weapons is to deter a Russian invasion.
And you're talking Kazakhstan's recent acquisition of weapons and recent sort of revamping of their military structures, which would really only be useful in the event of a Russian invasion, right?
Precisely. And so all of that is framing for my question, which is that if the Russians come to the Chinese and say, look, all of these things are taking place in Kazakhstan, we know that you actually don't want to give us up. It would be politically unpalatable, and just from an IR standpoint, unpalatable for China-US competition going forward. You don't want this. Let us help you do your dirty work, and let's help bring to power a regime in Kazakhstan that would be more endemic to both, more amenable to both of our interests. To me, I tend to think that that's an argument that the Chinese would find somewhat persuasive. I know that
I think it would depend on the circumstances, right? If Beijing perceived that there truly was a risk of real color revolution in Kazakhstan, and to sort of unpack that term, just basically grassroots democratization, overthrowing strongman rulers, which is a nightmare to Beijing and to Putin, right? This is not what they want. So if there was a real threat of that happening, and Kazakhstan becoming this sort of like democratic bastion in Central Asia, and a bad example to the rest of Central Asia from Beijing's point of view, and I think they might. They spend narratives like this all the time. They're doing it with Ukraine right now. They're saying like this was not Ukraine's war. This was like CIA, and they were trying to push different parties, and so they're all just puppets. They're all working at the behest of Washington, and so they spin these narratives, do mental gymnastics in order to justify supporting something very controversial, but they don't do it for just anything. So if they were really truly worried about a color revolution turning Kazakhstan into a liberal democratic bastion in Central Asia, I think they might support some sort of Russian intervention. It is worth saying that Kazakhstan is different from Ukraine because Kazakhstan has a huge border with China, and trying to overthrow the government of a country that borders China is understandably more prickly to Beijing than just Ukraine, which is not great. China cares about influence in Central and Eastern Europe, certainly. But it's a different story when it's on their border, which is why it leads me to believe this would have to be a really credible risk and a worry of an impending color revolution in Kazakhstan. And even then, I think it would be a bit of a Faustian gamble, a deal with the devil that China might say yes, but it might be similar to, well, we don't know what happened in Ukraine, but it could be very similar. It sold a bad bill of goods, or they agree on one thing and then another happens. So that would be a nightmare situation for China, but it's potential they would agree to something like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I should reiterate for our listeners that this is a hypothetical that we're still quite
this is not impending.
I think it's just a useful way to think about the drivers and constraints on the relationship and things that could add tensions to it, or where in a moment of make or break it actually could bring them even closer together. So it's very useful in that sense.
So to get out of the sort of worst case scenario, testing the bounds of this relationship, can we get sort of into what we are seeing right now, which is this Russia-China competition in Central Asia, where Russia sort of has got the security side, if I'm not wrong here, through CSTO and wanting to sort of shape its periphery and make sure that those countries develop along the lines politically that Russia would like them to. And then you've got China trying to use Central Asia as a thoroughfare, not only as a region for China to boost its own interest in Central Asia for access to minerals, to fuel, but also for pipelines and transit routes through Kazakhstan, through the rest of Central Asia, into South Asia, into the Middle East, into Eastern Europe. So this is a really important place for China, that this place stays open for business, and that it doesn't, become just another satellite of Russia. That would not be good. But even, Russia doesn't make any moves, all of that. We're just saying, what we're dealing with now, yeah, China's quite, I don't know about concern, but one of their chief priorities is keeping this region open to all that business. Because it's the Silk Road, right? None of this happens without Central Asia, even though you might say this is sort of an economic backwater, and it doesn't matter as much as Europe or Latin America or Asia, but the Belt and Road goes straight through it. So,
Yeah.
and yeah, I'm curious about your view on the Central Asia dynamic between Russia and China, where it stands now, not necessarily the worst case scenarios.
Absolutely. And where it stands now is that China has stopped new BRI investments in Russia, which obviously used to be a very obvious transit corridor, but BRI investment in Kazakhstan and other countries in Central Asia continue. Moreover, you're seeing more efforts to develop the so-called trans-Caspian corridor, where Chinese goods would drive across Kazakhstan and then be put on boats across the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, from Azerbaijan to Georgia, and
the goal there is this is a route that doesn't rely on going through Russia.
Yes, it's essentially passing through the fewest countries possible, and of course bypassing Russia to reach Europe, right? Because it's just Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and then you're already in the EU. So,
and what's the goal of that, right? Because ostensibly, they're partners. They're very close partners, Russia and China. So why do they care about avoiding Russia?
Well, I mean, you can certainly add to this, but I think part of it is that, right, Russia is seen as a sanctions risk. It's the economy and long-term investment, including in the country's infrastructure, is seen as shaky. If I was a Chinese logistics company or a Chinese business, I would say, why would I want to run my supply chains through, or my delivery chains, or any part of my supply chain through Russia?
Yeah, I mean, we saw some of that early on in the Ukraine war, right, with these Russian rail lines, and companies just choosing not to ship on those lines because they feared sanctions risk was there, even if it wasn't there yet. So they saw that China saw, and Chinese vendors saw, they have to ship these things through Russia. And when Russia's invading Ukraine, that becomes a reputational compliance risk.
Absolutely. And you can add to that by just knowing that Russia's physical rail infrastructure is aging. The state rail operator is in financial straits because people have stopped using it. There's a collapse of demand. Even back in December, I remember talking to our colleague Roger about this. The state rail company asked for a stupendous bailout to re-amp the entire rail system as it has to deal with higher maintenance costs related to climate change and things like that, as we funnily just discussed prior to this call. And so you look at all those factors, and that's why Kazakhstan continues to be a place where the Chinese are saying, well, actually, China and Kazakhstan and Russia have tensions, and maybe it's actually better that we put more of our economic eggs in, at least in this case, in Kazakhstan's basket than in Russia's. I should add to this that, just as a general fact, right, the traditional dynamic that you mentioned, Russia does security, China does economics, that disbalance is actually growing. So the Chinese trade with Kazakhstan is way up. Kazakh trade with Russia is declining. So China is actually gaining its economic influence in the country. Even former areas where the Russians used to have a relatively stronger position, things like automobiles, now Russian automobile sales to Kazakhstan have fallen, and of course Kazakhstan's buying more Chinese automobiles and things like that. So you're even seeing now the Chinese break into the few economic bastions that the Russians still had in the region. The one economic thing that the Russians still do have on their side is, of course, the rail gauge. The whole region still uses the Russian-Soviet wide gauge rail, and that's what makes there have to be these large dry ports on the Chinese-Kazakhstan border. And then the other big economic factor there is the corruption. So every year, I forget the number, but it's like dozens of billions of dollars that the customs data between the Kazakh and the Chinese sources differ each year, which is just an astounding number. And so it obviously begs all these questions of it seems that, you know, Chinese and Kazakh, but probably mostly Kazakh officials engage in all kinds of inflation of the price of products and other various schemes to exploit that situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that China has been uncomfortable with before, working in regions with high risk of corruption. They seem to know how to do business there, or at least they're just highly risk tolerant from that standpoint. They're willing to take that. So yeah, so we just had a question there.
Yeah, we got a fun question that I think we would be remiss to not take a stab at. We said, does China have a long-term interest in regime change in Russia? I'll take an initial stab on this, but I know that you would probably be better to answer.
I do have thoughts, but go for it.
So look, I am aware of a perception in China that, and you to tell me if this is wrong, that right. So the Chinese government is still a communist regime that shared a lot of history with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and had close ties with them, etc. There was, of course, the Sino-Soviet split and all of that history. But right, what is Russia now? Russia is an ultra nationalist, essentially a fascist, oligarchic, highly corrupt regime that, you know, has all kinds of issues related to internal stability and questionable popularity and a corrupt elite that was so influenced by the West that Putin is now struggling to make sure that this elite, right, stops traveling to the West, starts removing all their funds from the West. And so if I were the Chinese, I would look at the Russian regime and say, this is a regime that is potentially questionable and unstable. And, you know, just as a hypothetical, why would we not want to have a potentially more leftist regime in Russia that would, you know, be more just and be a better long-term partner to tie our interests to? That's kind of an abstract view of how I would approach it. But as a direct matter of fact, right, for the reasons that you said, they're not looking to shake that relationship in any way.
Yeah, and the pragmatic differs from the ideological greatly. Yeah, sure, back in the Mao days, China wanted worldwide communist revolution, and they wanted other governments like theirs, and that's where they privileged aid, they privileged diplomatic relations. Since then, China has become much more pragmatic. They make friends with countries that, one, they can trade with from a pure economic standpoint, but two, that can help sustain their own political model and defend their interests on the world stage. And it really doesn't matter what form that takes. If it's a democracy that just so happens to be quite friendly to China, fantastic. If it's Kim Jong-un's North Korea, well, they cause trouble sometimes, but still fantastic. If they can support our interests in some way, great. So I think China's interest, Beijing's interest, I should clarify again, the Chinese people have very little say in this, but Beijing's interest is in keeping regimes in power that keep China, or keep the Chinese Communist Party in power. And as long as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have this very close personal relationship, and Xi Jinping isn't going anywhere anytime soon, especially under Xi, he doesn't want Putin going anywhere. They have a very close relationship, and like I mentioned earlier, are very similar ideals on, you know, the evils of Western liberal democracy. So they don't want regime change in Russia, because who knows what could come next. This is the enemy I know, enemy, so to speak. Really, it's their closest friend. This is the friend I know. Why would I want someone else?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I agree with all of that 100%. And not that this is, again, not likely at all in the foreseeable future, but even the worst nightmare scenarios, you have somebody of kind of the Russian liberal movement, somebody like an Alexei Navalny. If he were to become the president of Russia, then
China's nightmare.
Yeah. So in general, right, to answer the question, it seems that that's not something that would be realistically considered.
What about, and I've heard this one asked in a number of different contexts and framings, but the prospect for Russia to basically collapse and to become a vassal state of China's, and not politically, not governmentally China owning Russia or anything like that, but the partnerships becomes even more skewed, or Russia's a failed state basically, and China's this big, powerful partner. And so the partnership becomes very much like China has all the leverage and Russia's just there because it has few other partners.
Yeah.
So there's a baked in question there of, is there any possibility of that happening in Russia? And then I would say, like, what does Russia bring to the table from your eyes to this partnership?
Yeah. So to answer the first part, I think that we need to understand that already there are the dependence that Russia has on China could already allow you to reasonably argue that Russia is trending towards that kind of vassal status to China. Russia would economically collapse if it could not sell the oil and gas that it's currently selling to China, and if it could not buy the things from China that it's currently buying from China. All the things that it used to import from the West now all predominantly comes through China. If those two things were not taking place, Russia would not be economically stable in any sense right now. And so in that way, you could argue that they're already kind of dependent on China. In terms of,
and so just to explore that a little bit, I know you have another part of the question I asked you, but so from your standpoint, there's very little that could push Russia because of that to ditch the Chinese relationship. There's just too much to gain there.
No. The Russians, it's the importance of the relationship with China is the central tenet of their whole foreign policy, particularly even after Putin's speech today. Putin's whole speech today was just essentially about making this global alliance with China and the third world to stand up to alleged Western neo-imperialism. I mean,
right.
Russia is putting all of its eggs in this basket. And it's strange to see, because you almost get the sense that these are things that Putin threatened in a negotiation with Joe Biden, for example, and Putin didn't necessarily believe or buy into these things several years ago, and you get the sense that it's almost that Russia is doing this because these are the threats that were made, and now they have to be followed up upon. And just
which threats are you referencing there specifically?
Oh, that we're going to decouple from the West if you don't
Gotcha.
cave to us on Ukraine, right? Ukraine is our Cuban Missile Crisis. If you don't cave to us on Ukraine, then this is what we're going to do. Just for context, right? Remember, the U.S. and Russia had this strategic stability dialogue for several months, for months and months and months at the start of the Biden administration, and it became clear from reports that Russia would try to exchange concessions on things like arms control for Ukraine, and the U.S. is like, you can't, right? Ukraine is a separate thing. Arms control is about bilateral relations between
right.
us, right? And so Russia kept trying to make Ukraine about an element of the bilateral strategic stability, and that's another thing that kind of led to this understanding that, oh, Putin is actually serious about these threats. But yeah, I can't remember what the original question about that all was, but
it was more generally about the extent of the Russian dependence on the Chinese relationship, yes. And what, if anything, could drive them to ditch China? Not much. And what about this narrative of a vassal state, Russia collapsing, becoming a vassal state?
Yeah, the thing I wanted to add in about vassal state is, look, I mean, the bottom line is that as this war rages on, as it appears it will, although it could end sooner, because there's some evidence to suggest that Russia could start waving around or even using its nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, etc. But the war is on a trajectory to grind on, right? Which is something that a lot of us didn't think that, right? Why would it be in Russia's strategic interest to mire itself in a gigantic European land war for years or even decades, etc. But that's what it's done, and I think the real risk is to Russia itself and kind of the continuity of the regime. And as the Russians say themselves, right, this is not something that the West ever says, right? I mean, the West would say that if Russia loses the war, it just retreats to its internationally recognized borders and nothing happens, right? But within Russia itself, right, Putin flames all this rhetoric about how Russia could collapse, and about how Russia, the West wants regions of Russia to break apart and spread apart. I should say that the Ukrainians are essentially kind of endorse this. They think that the minor Russian nations of the Caucasus should rise up and should oppose the war. The same goes for the Turkic peoples and other peoples of the various Asian nations of the Asian part of Russia, etc. And so look, these questions do come up when we talk about kind of the long term, and if these kind of regionalist movements are taking place within Russia, then yeah, I think it does bring this question of how does China conduct itself in relation to that? Does China stick with the central government? Does China endorse Russia using force to use riot police to squash uprising or movements in the country,
I mean, that stuff's no problem. That's from Beijing's point of view. That's no problem. They obviously have to do the rhetorical gymnastics and the propaganda to say why Russia is justified. These are all CIA inspired revolutions. This is not the Russian people speaking. So we support Russia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, look, the bottom line is that I mean, is a Russia where those kinds of things are taking place? I mean, that's an even weaker Russia with an even weaker negotiating position vis-a-vis China. So it's just about how Russia has all of these challenges that are going to make it essentially quite subservient to China, and that's what a lot of commentators noted about the Xi Putin meeting, right? Where Putin, the first thing he said is that we are conscious of China's questions and concerns, right? People interpreted it as this important gesture where Putin wanted to tell the international cameras that, right, Russia acknowledges, right, China's potential dissatisfaction, right? And Putin is not shameful about, or bashful or whatever. What's the word? He doesn't care about that because I mean the relationship's so important, and if even making gestures of potential subservience to China is not considered any unpopular or a problem for Russia, because they quite frankly understand how important the Chinese are, and the Chinese I'm sure love that, right? Because the Chinese don't want to come in and militarily dominate people, but they do love to see these gestures of people demonstrating that they're appreciative of China's interests and China's concerns and China, right?
Yeah, that's the best kind of support to Beijing, is someone voluntarily comes forward at an international forum and says how valid China's interests and performance is. That's like gold. That's perfect.
Yes.
Even if it's coming from Russia,
is
your best ally, you would expect nothing else, right?
So Putin is giving them the gold that they want.
Yeah, but I would say so, like that makes sense for sort of like the generic or the general weakening of Russia and that putting China in a better position. But I would say China's position itself in the globe is also weakening a bit with its diplomatic relations with the West, which it's not just the diplomacy and the niceties of who says nice things about the other. It's the trade, right? You have the EU China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment is permanently on hold because their relations with Europe are so bad right now. So even though Russia's got all these issues of like what happens to Putin if they don't win the war, like this is all critical for the regime, on China's side, their group of friends is getting smaller and smaller into like global South countries who, compared to China, economically don't matter, but they technically support China. So like their friend group is getting smaller. So even if the power balance in their relationship is getting stronger, like China also relies on that Russian relationship, even if you could say Russia's power in that relationship's weakening.
That's a fascinating point. One thing I did want to ask you though is a couple days ago, or maybe even yesterday, there was the item about the Chinese continuing their foreign policy kind of approach and course, and there was some really interesting data from Pew, which basically showed that almost every country either has the same opinion of China or worse, or often way worse than they did. In
the West, it was a very like Western country favored poll from Pew. They had a couple of global South countries in there, but yeah, generally among the West, which it matters because the West has a large proportion of economic powerhouses, right? And if those economic powerhouses are all saying, yeah, we don't know what's going on in China right now, but we're not happy about it, that matters. And that was what China, the Global Times put out, like, oh, the Pew Research Group put a so-called survey, and it was really just all the pro-West, pro-US countries. And of course they're not happy because the US is, instilling their minds with, poison and all of this.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But it's certainly, and it's something that we just talked about this the other day. China does not seem to be Beijing does not seem to be learning from its diplomatic mistakes. And I think this is part of Xi Jinping's own sort of brand of public diplomacy, is never apologize. Like, we've apologized for way too long. We've been sort of pragmatic and nice, while the world has imposed, countless humilities on China, going back from, the Qing dynasty and, the imperial powers and the breaking up of China, all that. And so Xi's basic point of view is we have nothing to apologize for. And if any country in the world has any issue that is going against China's development, we're going to call it out loudly and proudly. And as we've seen, that doesn't work. It makes China feel good, but it doesn't work. It doesn't ingratiate China to the West. But what we saw was the vice foreign minister the other day coming out and saying, yeah, this isn't changing. We're going to keep doing this. And it's ahead of the National Party Congress. So it makes sense to be like, yay, Xi's policies are great and I support them. But also, this is our general take, is that as long as Xi's in power, this bold, aggressive course in grading China on the international stage is here to stay, which means that sort of weakening of its group of friends, and thus reliance on Russia, sticks around.
And it applies to Russia too. They're not going to go around apologizing for their support of Russia, their special position, which, by the way, still has very clear limits. Let's remind our readers that China does not recognize the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. It's not going to recognize these territorial changes in Russia. So there's some pretty, so we're talking large territories of claimed Russia that China will not, officially recognize before international bodies. So
and to emphasize that point further, this shows just how strong China's need or desire to stay friends with Russia is, because one of China's core tenets of its foreign policy, it bases everything around this, is the non-interference of states in other states' affairs. Because China's constantly complaining to the West about this. Stop talking about Xinjiang. Stop talking about Tibet, Taiwan. This is none of your business. This is our country. That's what they say. So with Ukraine, right, another country is interfering in its internal affairs, and China's just saying, well, Russia has some understandable misgivings, and it's basically NATO's fault anyway, and Ukraine doesn't want this. So they're breaching one of their core foreign policy tenets just to support the friendship with Russia, which shows just how strong their need and or desire is for that partnership.
Oh, but not recognizing Russia's annexations in Ukraine is one of the ways that they, in theory, can say that they're still holding to the principles. It's very interesting. Okay, well, I feel like we've hit a lot of the main interesting points. Maybe one last thing I would mention is, there's the reporting on this is very difficult. And of course, when the US Treasury sanctions somebody, they're not going to tell us, oh, X did Y and Z at this time, at this date, at this location, and so on. Right. But, we do have another Chinese company getting sanctioned. This is the S&D list. So this is the real, bad boys club. But for a Chinese electronics company that was presumably helping the Russian military. Right. But it's another example of how, with or without or let's not even speculate on the government's role in this, but there's very clear, because there's a demand for help, in this case from electronics for the Russian military. Presumably somebody in China is willing to take the risks and to provide these kinds of things to Russia.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell how much of this is just because, like we talked about earlier, this is gray zone, right? The US gets to define exactly what kinds of behaviors count as supporting the Russian military, right? There's an infinite amount of transactions that could count as that, and they're specifically choosing which ones are sort of either the most egregious cases or the ones that send the clearest message to certain countries they believe would be engaging in this activity. So it's hard for Beijing, even if it wanted to say, please stop, to Chinese companies, please stop anything that could risk sanctions. And they have said that. They've said it to state-owned firms, to public firms, to banks, do not risk this, because they know, as much as they rail against it, against Western, financial hegemony, and the US runs the markets and it's not fair, they realize it's reality and they don't want to get sanctioned. So yeah, it seems to me that Beijing genuinely is trying to not supply Russia with these goods, not because they don't want to, but because pragmatically they can't afford the economic damage of having widespread sanctions on China, all because of something Russia is doing. But yeah, clearly the U.S. is willing to push the bar a little further and say, no, we're not satisfied that you're not supplying them with goods, and here's an example of a company.
Yeah.
And it seems like a relatively small or insignificant company. Wasn't able to do a ton of research on it today, but not a huge name everyone would realize or recognize. But yeah, notable for sure.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there. This was a real pleasure, Chase. I really enjoyed this. I'm sure our readers did too.
This relationship is a wellspring. I mean, it's we could talk about the Russia-China relationship forever, and it's not going anywhere. And it seems like as the war goes on, it's just going to get more interesting.
Absolutely. So please follow us at RANE and RANE.com for more information. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks.